At first glance, Stanley, Swede Vejtasa looked like the kind of pilot the war would chew up and forget. Wrong airplane, wrong odds, wrong place at the wrong time. Yet, in the span of a few months, this quiet junior officer would do something almost no one in the U.S. Navy thought was possible. Outfight Japan's elite Zero pilots in a slow dive bomber, then later save an entire carrier with a single mission, and still walk away without the Medal of Honor he was recommended for. And the strangest part, the Navy didn't deny him because he wasn't brave enough. They denied him because his heroism exposed how badly the higher-ups had messed up. On the morning of May 8th, 1942, in the Coral Sea, 27-year-old Lieutenant Junior Grade Stanley Vejtasa climbed into his Douglas SBD Dauntless on the deck of USS Yorktown. He knew the numbers. He knew the odds. The Japanese had launched a full strike. Carrier-based aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku were closing in. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. Among them were Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, the most feared carrier fighters on the planet. The Dauntless was not built to fight them. Fully loaded, the SBD weighed nearly 11,000 pounds. Top speed, around 250 miles per hour. In a turn, it lumbered around the sky like a flying truck. The Zero, by comparison, could reach over 330 miles per hour, whip around in tight circles, and climb like a homesick angel. American pilots had run the numbers. In a straight-up dogfight, an SBD versus a Zero wasn't a duel, it was a sentence. But Yorktown had a bigger problem than math. Her strike aircraft were still out, trying to find and hit the Japanese carriers. Her fighter cover was thin. There simply weren't enough Wildcats to cover every angle. If torpedo planes got through, one lucky hit could rip a carrier open. So, a desperate idea appeared on the board. Use the dive bombers as improvised interceptors. It sounded almost insane. The SBD had two forward-firing, 50 caliber machine guns and a rear gunner with 30 caliber guns. Sure, but it was slow, heavy, and not maneuverable. Still, Captain Frederick Sherman of USS Lexington had pushed the concept, a low-altitude anti-torpedo plane patrol made of dauntless crews prepared to pounce on incoming Kates. On Yorktown, 8 SBDs from Scouting Squadron 5 were assigned to this mission. Vejtasa led a 4-plane section. Their job was simple on paper and lethal in reality. Orbit at low level, catch Japanese torpedo bombers as they came in, and shoot them down before they could launch. No one spent much time talking about what would happen if Zero fighters found them first. The odds in the Pacific at this point were brutal. Japanese pilots had years of training and real combat experience. Many had fought over China. Their aircraft were purpose-built for range and agility. American carrier aviators, in contrast, were learning as they went. They flew planes designed before anyone truly understood carrier warfare. The kill ratios reflected that. In the first half year of the war, Zeros were racking up staggering numbers. For every one Zero shot down, a dozen Allied aircraft might go down with it. Vejtasa knew all this. He'd already survived Tulagi and earlier strikes in the Coral Sea. His squadron had lost planes, friends, crewmates. He also knew the one thing the SBD had going for it, sheer toughness and firepower. The Dauntless carried heavy, 50 caliber guns forward, armor behind the pilot, and self-sealing fuel tanks. It could take punishment and keep flying. The Zero, on the other hand, had almost no armor and no self-sealing tanks. It was designed to be light and lethal, not durable. One good burst could turn it into a burning wreck. The problem, of course, was getting that burst on target before a Zero pilot chewed you to pieces. At 10:55 a.m., Yorktown's radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike. Fighter directions scrambled the Wildcats to intercept, but placed them too low, expecting torpedo planes instead of high-flying bombers. The Wildcats missed. That left 8 Dauntlesses between the Japanese and the carriers. 8 slow dive bombers against dozens of enemy aircraft. Vejtasa spotted them first, a swarm of aircraft breaking through the clouds. He counted roughly 50. 8 of them peeled off and headed straight for his tiny section. 8 Zeros versus 4 Dauntlesses. On paper, it wasn't a fight. It was a cull. What those Zero pilots didn't know was that Stanley Vejtasa had learned something during training that no SBD manual had written down in bold letters, something his commanding officer had hammered into his head. If you run, you die. Turn into the attack. The first Zero opened fire from 800 yards. Tracers stitched the air. Normal instinct when a faster, more nimble fighter attacks you from above is to dive away, run for the deck, and pray you can make it back to your own ships. That was the standard advice for slow aircraft. Use gravity, build speed, and hope the enemy overshoots. Vejtasa did the opposite. He shoved his stick forward and then hauled it into a hard turn toward the incoming fighter. In that instant, the geometry flipped. Instead of a clean tail chase, the Zero pilot suddenly faced a head-on closing speed of hundreds of miles per hour, with the target twisting into his line of sight. 2 seconds, maybe less. That's all the time a pilot has to adjust his aim in that situation. Most can't. They either miss or risk a collision. The Zero broke off to avoid smashing into the Dauntless. Vejtasa had survived the first pass. The next minute was chaos. Zeros slashed in from every angle. Each time one committed to an attack, he turned into it, using the heavy nose of his bomber as a weapon. His rear gunner strafed the sky with his guns, forcing attacking fighters to think twice about settling in behind them. Around them, other SBDs were being cut apart. Within 5 minutes, half the 8-plane patrol was gone. Burning wreckage tumbled into the Coral Sea. Some crews bailed out, some never had the chance. It was exactly the kind of massacre the Dauntless pilots had always feared. But Vejtasa kept playing with the geometry of death. At one point, a Zero pressed a head-on pass too long. The Japanese pilot gambled that his speed and cannons would win the exchange. Vejtasa's 50 calibers spoke first. A short, savage burst tore into the fighter. The engine exploded. Oil and coolant sprayed across the sky, and the Zero rolled over and plunged down. The second kill came in much the same way. Another pilot misjudged the merge, and another Zero paid for it. The third encounter was so tight that some witnesses later claimed the 2 planes physically clipped wings. Both pilots refused to give way until the absolute last moment. They missed each other by feet. The Zero lost control and spiraled into the sea. 3 kills. In a dive bomber that was supposed to be a sitting duck. But the battle raging around them wasn't over. The Japanese strike force was still bearing down on Yorktown and Lexington. Torpedo planes were lining up their final approaches. Destroyers and cruisers couldn't protect the carriers if those Kates got in close. So, with a battered aircraft and dwindling ammunition, Vejtasa pointed his nose toward the torpedo planes. The Japanese Type 97 Kate torpedo bombers flew low over the Coral Sea, barely above the waves. Each one carried a Type 91 torpedo, a weapon that had already wrecked battleships and cruisers from Hawaii to the South Pacific. From above, the Kates looked slow and steady, locked into straight lines, but they were fast enough to outpace a Dauntless in level flight. The only way to catch them was to dive from altitude and use gravity as an engine booster. That was exactly what the anti-torpedo plane patrol concept had been designed for. It just hadn't been tested under real, chaotic battle conditions. As Vejtasa dove, the official reports would later note that the SBDs attempted to intercept the Kates, but were too slow to fully break up the formation. Some torpedo bombers had already started their runs. On Lexington, 2 torpedoes slammed into her port side. She shuddered, flooding began, and though her crew fought like demons to keep her alive, internal explosions hours later doomed Lady Lex to the bottom. On Yorktown, Captain Elliot Buckmaster threaded his ship through a forest of torpedo wakes. 11 weapons were launched at her. All of them missed. Vejtasa's Dauntless was now peppered with bullet holes, glass shattered, controls partly damaged. but the engine still coughed out power, and somehow the aircraft held together well enough to return to Yorktown. He landed with a plane that looked more like a sieve than a machine. Ground crews counted dozens of holes. Still, he had done something no one in his right mind would have expected of a dive bomber pilot. 3 zeros down, lived through an 8-on-4 ambush, and thrown himself at torpedo planes for good measure. Most aviators would have ended their legend right there. For Vejtasa, the Navy had other plans. The brass needed fighter pilots. The carrier war was burning through them faster than they could be trained. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the loss of Lexington, the damage to Saratoga, the endless skirmishes over the Pacific, all of it had gutted experienced squadrons. And now, they had this dauntless pilot who had just embarrassed 0 fighters in a plane that had no business fighting them. So they transferred him to fighters. He joined Fighting Squadron 10, the Grim Reapers, under Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley. Flatley wasn't just a good pilot, he was a thinker. He had already clashed with Zeros and survived. More importantly, he refused to accept the idea that the Zero was unbeatable. Together with other tactical minds like John Thatch, Flatley had been studying Japanese aircraft. Their strengths were obvious. Their weaknesses were less glamorous, but just as real. The Zero's light construction made it fragile at high speeds. Its guns ran out of cannon ammo quickly. Its lack of armor meant one good burst from American. 50 seconds could erase it from the sky. The Grim Reapers didn't train to dogfight the Japanese on their terms. They trained to hit hard, hit fast, and control energy, diving attacks from altitude, slashing passes, teamwork, never turn fighting where the Zero was strongest. Vejtasa fit this mentality perfectly. He already had the instinct to attack into danger instead of away from it. He pushed for more aggressive tactics, turning defensive maneuvers into opportunities to strike. By the time Fighting Squadron 10 was ready for combat in late 1942, the war had shifted. Midway had crippled Japan's carrier force. The U.S. had landed on Guadalcanal. Henderson Field was a fragile foothold holding back a tidal wave. The Japanese weren't done, though. They were assembling a new major carrier strike to crush Guadalcanal and wipe the American carriers from the map. The next big clash would come near the Santa Cruz Islands, and once again, Vejtasa would fly straight into a situation that should have killed him. The setup to the Battle of Santa Cruz was a mess even before the first bomb fell. On October 25, 1942, a PBY Catalina reported a Japanese carrier force at extreme range. Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid, in command of Task Force 61, faced a painful choice: strike first at long distance and risk losing planes in the dark on the way back, or wait and risk being hit first. He ordered a complex search and strike mission. Enterprise, which was supposed to act partly as a duty carrier and hold fighters back for defense, ended up launching large portions of her air group on a search that turned out to be badly plotted. The search patterns were aimed at empty ocean. Fuel was tight. Sunset was coming. Vejtasa and the other pilots quickly realized this mission was skating on the edge of disaster. They flew for hours and found nothing. Then they turned back toward the calculated rendezvous point, and Enterprise wasn't there. The carrier had maneuvered away, reacting to submarine threats and other concerns. In the vast Pacific, even a relatively small course change could put ship and air group miles apart. Radio silence sealed the trap. Pilots began watching their fuel gauges creep toward empty. Some ditched. Some circled in the gathering darkness, praying for a miracle. Vejtasa remembered one small detail from earlier that day. Enterprise had been leaking oil. A faint slick trailed behind her hull as she steamed through the water. In failing light, he dropped low and began sweeping the sea for that thin, rainbow streak on the waves. He found it. Following that shimmering trail, he led aircraft back to their carrier. Night landings on a pitching deck, fuel near zero, tempers high, nerves shredded. It was the kind of recovery that kills people even in training. But they made it. Barely. The price, though, was heavy. The air group was exhausted and reduced before the main event even started. The next morning, when Japanese scouts finally locked onto the American carriers, Enterprise did not have the ideal, rested, fully fueled fighter screen she should have had. And now Japan was sending everything. On October 26th, 1942, over the Santa Cruz Islands, the skies filled with aircraft. Japanese carriers launched coordinated waves, dive bombers, torpedo planes, Zero escorts. American reconnaissance finally pinpointed the enemy, and U.S. carriers sent their own strikes. Both sides were about to hammer each other at the same time. Vejtasa was in the air with Fighting Squadron 10, flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Compared to the Zero, the Wildcat was slower and less maneuverable, but it was a flying brick, armed with 6 heavy, 50 seconds, and deadly in a dive. Radar calls came in, large formations inbound. First, they hit Hornet. Japanese Vals and Kates swarmed the carrier, and despite fierce defense, bombs and torpedoes slammed home. Flames erupted, systems failed. Within minutes, Hornet was a crippled, burning wreck. Vejtasa did what he could, diving on incoming dive bombers and trying to break up their attack runs. He managed to shoot down one Val before it could release its bomb. Another, heavily damaged, turned into what might have been a kamikaze-style plunge, impacting the ship and showering her decks with burning fuel. But the heart of his legend at Santa Cruz wasn't over Hornet. It was what he did when the Japanese turned on Enterprise. The second wave came for the last major U.S. carrier left in the region. Among them were 20 Nakajima B-5N Kates, lining up from multiple directions for a torpedo assault that could have finished the job Japan started at Pearl Harbor. A carrier can sometimes dodge one torpedo, maybe two, but a coordinated multi-axis attack? That's how you sink a fleet's last hope. Vejtasa dove into them. He picked out a group of Kates coming in from the port side and attacked from above and behind, using every bit of altitude he had to build speed. At about 400 yards, he opened up with all 6 guns. One Kate simply blew apart. The rest of the formation scattered. Some jettisoned their torpedoes in panic, dumping them harmlessly into the sea. Others tried to hold formation but now had a wildcat roaring around them, tearing into anything that stayed on a straight line. Vejtasa didn't stop. He shot down a second Kate, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. By the end of the engagement, combined with the dive bombers he had already taken out earlier, his tally for that single mission stood at 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 7. In one day, while defending the last major U.S. carrier in the region. Enterprise was hit by bombs but survived. The torpedo attack that should have been fatal had been shattered in midair. Back on the ship, Jimmy Flatley wrote a simple line in Vejtasa's record that would echo through history. Greatest single combat flight in history. And he meant it. He wasn't just being poetic. The Navy already had a famous hero in Edward O'Hare, who had shot down 5 bombers in one mission protecting Lexington earlier in the war. O'Hare had received the Medal of Honor. Vejtasa had just surpassed that record under equally desperate conditions. Flatley did what any commander who understood the scale of that achievement would do. He nominated Stanley Swede Vejtasa for the Medal of Honor. The nomination started climbing the chain of command. Flatley's write-up spelled it out. 7 confirmed kills, a broken torpedo attack, a carrier saved, a campaign possibly preserved. He compared Vejtasa's performance directly to O'Hare's Medal of Honor mission and argued this was at least equal, if not greater. Then the paperwork reached Admiral Thomas Kinkaid. Kinkaid had problems. Yes, the Japanese had taken heavy losses in planes and irreplaceable pilots at Santa Cruz, but tactically, the battle looked like an American defeat. Hornet was sunk. Enterprise was heavily damaged. The U.S. was down to a single carrier, still limping along in the Pacific. On top of that, some of the pre-battle decisions, particularly the ill-planned search missions and chaotic fighter direction, looked bad in hindsight. Very bad. Now imagine what happens if a Medal of Honor is awarded for heroism that only became necessary because those decisions almost cost the U.S. its last carrier. Questions start getting asked. Reporters dig. Historians look around and say, hold on, why were only 8 Wildcats defending 2 carriers? Why were pilots nearly lost the night before the battle? Why was everything so close to disaster? Kinkaid quietly downgraded the recommendation. Instead of the Medal of Honor, Vejtasa received his 3rd Navy Cross. Still a high honor, still recognition of extreme bravery, but not the one his squadron believed he had earned. Within Fighting Squadron 10, the decision stunned pilots. Some would say later that he deserved the top award just for Coral Sea, never mind Santa Cruz. Others pointed to the combination Dauntless Ace, Fighter Ace, Carrier Savior, and shook their heads. Vejtasa never launched a public campaign. He never went on a media tour. He never turned his missing medal into a personal crusade. He did what a lot of that generation did. He saluted, accepted what he was given, and went back to work. After Santa Cruz, his combat days tapered off, but his influence didn't. He went stateside and trained new pilots, passing on all the hard-earned lessons that had kept him alive. He served in the Korean War, took on staff roles, attended the Naval War College, and rose through the ranks. In November 1962, 2 decades after he'd fought to keep Enterprise afloat, Stanley Vejtasa took command of USS Constellation. From a junior lieutenant in a slow dive bomber to captain of a supercarrier over 1,000 feet long, carrying jet aircraft capable of speeds that 1,942 pilots could barely imagine, it was a full-circle moment no screenwriter could improve. He retired in 1970 as a captain. 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Bronze Stars, the Legion of Merit, a chest full of decorations, but never the Medal of Honor that one of the Navy's most respected fighter leaders had recommended for him. Decades later, historians and authors would dig into his story. Ted Edwards wrote a biography, 7 at Santa Cruz, confirming through archival paperwork that the Medal of Honor nomination had been real and that it had been downgraded at a high level for reasons that had nothing to do with Vejtasa's courage in the sky. Stanley Swede Vejtasa passed away on January 23, 2013, at age 98. His ashes were scattered at sea in the same kind of ocean he'd once fought over in a shot-up Dauntless and an overworked Wildcat. He never pushed for his medal to be reconsidered. He never begged anyone to reopen the case. He let his record speak. And what does that record say? It says a man took an aircraft designed as a dive bomber and turned it into a Zero killer. It says he stared down impossible odds, 8 fighters against 4 bombers, and refused to die on schedule. It says he shredded a torpedo attack that should have ended Enterprise and maybe the Guadalcanal campaign with it. It says skill, nerve, and refusal to give up can bend the laws of probability in your favor. The lesson of Stanley Vejtasa isn't just about one pilot or one missing medal. It's about something bigger. The weapon matters less than the person wielding it. The airplane matters less than the heart inside the cockpit. If this story hit you the way it hits us, do one simple thing. Tap like so, more people get to hear about men like this. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and if anyone in your family ever served. You're not just someone scrolling past. By keeping stories like Vejtasa's alive, you're part of making sure these people don't vanish into silence. Because men who turned impossible into done deserve to be remembered.